The night air was thick and sour, a signature perfume of grease, stale beer, and decay that clung to the alley behind the restaurant. Zara's arms ached, the muscles protesting the weight of the last garbage bag. She heaved it over the lip of the dumpster, the plastic splitting with a groan and spilling something wet onto the grimy lid. She didn't care. The shift was over. 12 hours of forced smiles, of clearing half-eaten kimchi jjigae, of remembering who wanted their water with no ice and who wanted their soju bottle opened at the table. All for tips that would barely cover her bus pass for the week. A sound cut through the alley's usual symphony of dripping pipes and distant sirens. A soft, wet cough. It was close. Zara froze, her hand still on the dumpster. Her gaze dropped from the overflowing bin to the shadows that pooled at its base. At first, she saw only the suit. It was the kind of suit that cost more than her entire life, a charcoal so dark it drank the weak light from the security lamp overhead. It was ruined, torn at the shoulder and stained with something blacker than the fabric. Then she saw the man inside it. He was slumped against the cold metal of the dumpster, one leg bent at an unnatural angle. His head was bowed, black hair plastered to his forehead with sweat and blood. A single, elegant hand, fingers long and unnaturally still, rested on his knee. The cuff of his white shirt was soaked in red. She should have turned around, walked back inside, locked the door, and pretended she saw nothing. That was the smart thing to do. The sane thing to do. Los Angeles didn't reward curiosity, especially not in alleys like this one. But her feet were rooted to the spot, held there by the sheer wrongness of the image. A man dressed for a boardroom bleeding out next to her trash. He lifted his head, a slow, agonizing movement. The alley's gloom was merciful, but she could still make out the sharp line of his jaw, the bruised and swollen flesh around one eye. But it was his other eye, the one that found hers in the dark, that stopped her breath. It was sharp, shockingly alert, and held a cold, absolute certainty that pinned her where she stood. He wasn't just a victim. He was dangerous. Even broken, he was dangerous. "My car," he said. His voice was a low rasp, gravel and silk. It wasn't a request. It was a command issued from the bottom of a well. The black sedan. End of the alley. Zara swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. I should call someone. An ambulance. A flicker of something, not amusement, something colder, passed through his gaze.
No ambulance.
No police. He tried to push himself up, hissing as a fresh wave of pain hit him. His body slumped back against the metal. "The keys are in my pocket. Inside jacket pocket." This was insane. She was an 18-year-old waitress. She was nobody. This man was somebody, and the kind of somebody who ended up like this was not the kind you helped. You ran. But she saw the way his eyes scanned the mouth of the alley, the tense set of his shoulders despite the obvious agony. He wasn't just hurt. He was being hunted. And this alley was a trap. That was the moment everything changed. Her survival instinct, the one that screamed at her to run, was suddenly drowned out by a different, sharper one. The one that told her if she walked away, whoever was hunting him would find her next. A witness. A loose end. She took a hesitant step forward. The smell hit her then, iron and something else, a faint, expensive scent of cedar and smoke clinging to the wool of his suit. "Which pocket?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer, just watched her with that unnerving stillness. She knelt carefully, avoiding the dark, sticky pools spreading on the asphalt around him. Her fingers trembled as she reached inside his jacket. The silk lining was cool against her skin. She felt the hard rectangle of a phone, then the cool, heavy metal of a key fob. She pulled it out. A silver emblem of a luxury car brand she'd only ever seen in magazines. "Help me up," he ordered, his voice strained. She looped an arm under his, trying to take his weight. He was heavier than he looked, solid muscle and bone. He grunted, a raw sound of pain, as he put pressure on his good leg. He leaned on her heavily, his breath hot against her temple. For a moment, she was all that was holding him up, this terrifying, broken man. Her red work vest was instantly stained with his blood. They shuffled toward the end of the alley, a slow, agonizing procession. Every scrape of his shoe on the pavement sounded like a gunshot in the silence. The black sedan was exactly where he'd said, a sleek, predatory shape parked half on the curb. She clicked the fob and the lights flashed. Getting him into the passenger seat was a clumsy, painful ordeal. He collapsed onto the supple leather with a choked-off groan, his head falling back against the headrest. The pristine cream interior was now smeared with blood and grime. She slammed the door shut and ran around to the driver's side, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The car smelled of leather and him, that same cedar and smoke. It was a world away from the stale air of her own beat-up hatchback. She stabbed the start button, and the engine purred to life, a low, powerful rumble. "Where?" she asked, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. He didn't open his eyes.
Drive.
"Just get away from here." She pulled away from the curb, the tires squealing softly. She glanced in the rearview mirror. The alley was empty, a dark, silent mouth. But she felt them, the unseen eyes, the threat that was still there hunting. She had just stolen its prey. And she had the terrifying certainty that it knew her face. She told herself it was survival instinct. It felt like a lie. She drove him to the only sanctuary she had, her tiny, crumbling apartment in a part of town the luxury sedan had probably never seen. The building smelled of old cooking oil and damp carpet. He was a specter of wealth and violence in her narrow hallway, leaning against the peeling paint of the wall while she fumbled with the locks. Inside, he sank onto her lumpy sofa, the springs groaning in protest. The single lamp cast long shadows, making the small room feel even more cramped. His presence filled it, sucked the air out of it. He looked around, his one good eye taking in the second-hand furniture, the stack of overdue library books on her coffee table, the threadbare rug. She saw her life through his eyes, small, poor, insignificant. "Get me water," he said, his voice still rough. "And a cloth. Whatever you have for this." He gestured vaguely at the gash on his forehead. She moved on autopilot, her mind still reeling. In her tiny bathroom, she stared at her reflection. There was blood on her cheek. Her eyes were wide with a fear so profound it felt like a separate entity living inside her. She grabbed the sad-looking first aid kit from under the sink and a stack of washcloths that had seen better days. When she returned, he had managed to shrug out of his ruined suit jacket. His white shirt was a roadmap of blood. A dark, ugly bruise was blooming over his ribs. She hesitated, then knelt in front of him. "This is going to hurt," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. He just watched her, his expression unreadable. She gently cleaned the cut on his forehead, her touch surprisingly sure. He didn't flinch, but she felt the muscles in his jaw tighten. He was all coiled tension, a spring wound so tight it might snap. As she worked, her fingers brushed against his skin. It was hot, too hot. A fever was setting in. "Who did this to you?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. His gaze sharpened. "The less you know, the safer you will be." "I think we're a little past that," she shot back, dabbing antiseptic on a cotton ball with more force than necessary. He hissed, a sharp intake of breath. "My name is Jean Kwan," he said, as if that explained everything. To someone somewhere it probably did. "Zara," she replied, meeting his gaze. For a beat, there was just the sound of their breathing in the small room. His eyes held hers, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something other than cold command. It was a flicker of assessment, of curiosity. It was almost more unnerving than the danger. He slumped slightly, a wave of dizziness passing over him. His focus blurred. "Hannah," he murmured, his voice thick. "I told you not to wait." Zara paused, the cotton ball hovering over a cut on his cheek. The name hung in the air between them, heavy with a history she couldn't guess. It was the first crack in his armor, a glimpse of the man beneath the blood and the bespoke suit. He wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking through her at a ghost. "My name is Zara," she said again, softly but firmly. His eyes refocused on her, confusion warring with pain. He seemed to pull himself back from a great distance. "I know," he said, the word clipped. The wall was back up. She finished cleaning his wounds in silence. They were bad. He needed a doctor, stitches. But he'd been clear. No hospitals. She did what she could with butterfly bandages and gauze, her movements practiced and efficient. Her mother had been a nurse, and some of the lessons had stuck. When she was done, he was leaning back against the cushions, his eyes closed. His breathing was shallow. She didn't know what to do. She was a waitress, not a medic. She had a man named Jean Kwan bleeding on her sofa, a man who hallucinated a woman named Hannah, a man who was being hunted by people who would not hesitate to kill him. She sank to the floor, her back against the opposite wall, and watched him. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the old building, every siren in the distance, sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. Sometime before dawn, he began to shiver, the fever taking hold. She hesitated for only a moment before grabbing the thin quilt from her bed and draping it over him. His hand shot out, grabbing her wrist. His grip was surprisingly strong. His eyes were open, fever-bright but lucid. "Don't," he rasped. "You're freezing," she said, trying to pull her wrist away. His fingers were like steel bands. "They will find me," he said, his gaze locked on her face. "When they do, you will tell them you knew nothing, that I forced you. Do you understand?" "Who is they?" "My people." He released her wrist, the effort costing him. "They will not be gentle in their questions." The warning settled like ice in her stomach. He wasn't worried about his enemies finding them. He was worried about his friends. It was 2 hours later when they came. There was no knock. The lock on her door simply clicked, and the door swung inward. 2 men stepped inside, moving with a silent, synchronized grace that was utterly terrifying. They were dressed in dark, simple suits, their faces impassive, their eyes missing nothing. They saw her on the floor, saw Jean Kwan on the sofa, and their expressions didn't change. One of them knelt beside Jean Kwan, checking his pulse, his injuries, his gaze clinical. The other one turned his attention to Zara. He moved like the room owed him space. "Who are you?" he asked. His English was perfect, unaccented. "She helped me." Jean Kwan's voice cut through the tension. He was awake, pushing himself into a sitting position, his face pale, but his eyes clear and sharp. The authority in his voice was absolute. The man questioning Zara immediately straightened, his attention shifting to his boss. "Sir, we need to move you. This location is not secure."
"I'm aware," Yin Kwan snapped.
"Get the car ready. And bring a kit. A real 1-inch. The men moved to help him, but Jean Kwan held up a hand. He was looking at Zara. The room was silent except for the frantic beating of her own heart. This was her chance. She could let them take him and disappear. They would be gone, and she could try to pretend the last 12 hours never happened. She could run. But she knew, with a chilling certainty, that it was too late.
She was part of this now.
A loose thread they would have to cut. She saw it in the way the second man was still watching her, his hand resting inside his jacket. "She comes with us," Jean Kwan said. The second man blinked. "Sir, a civilian?" "She's not a civilian," Jean Kwan interrupted, his voice like ice. "She is with me. Get her a coat. We're leaving." The man looked from Jean Kwan to Zara and back again. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. He didn't question the order again. Zara didn't move. She was making a choice, or a choice was being made for her. Staying was dangerous. Leaving was suicide. She stood up, her legs unsteady. "I don't have another coat," she said, her voice small. Jean Kwan's gaze softened for a fraction of a second. He nodded to the first man, who shrugged off his own long, black wool overcoat and held it out to her. It was heavy and warm and smelled faintly of cold night air. As she slipped her arms into it, she felt like she was putting on a new skin. The skin of someone who belonged in their world. The choice was made. They took her to a place that didn't seem to exist. A penthouse apartment that crowned an anonymous glass skyscraper, its windows looking down on the sprawling galaxy of Los Angeles. The luxury was sterile and cold. White marble floors, black leather furniture, and vast, empty spaces. It felt less like a home and more like a beautiful, airtight prison. A doctor, a grim-faced man with unsteady hands, arrived to stitch Jean Quan up properly. Zara was sent to a guest room with a bed bigger than her entire living room and a silent instruction to stay there.
She didn't.
She stood in the doorway of the main living area, watching as the doctor worked. Jean Quan was shirtless, his torso a canvas of old, silvery scars and fresh, brutal bruises. He never made a sound, just stared at the ceiling, his jaw tight. When the doctor was finished, one of his men, the one who had given her his coat, handed him a thick envelope of cash and showed him to the door. For 2 days, Zara existed in a state of suspended reality. She ate food she didn't order, slept in a bed she didn't make, and watched Jean Quan as he recovered with unnatural speed. He took calls in Korean, his voice low and sharp, a blade carving up the quiet of the apartment. He met with his men, their faces grim, their reports delivered in hushed tones. She was a ghost in his world, present but unseen. Except by him. She would feel his eyes on her when she was looking out the window, or when she was curled up on one of the vast sofas, reading a book she'd found on a shelf. He watched her with an unnerving intensity, as if she were a puzzle he was trying to solve. The attack came on the 3rd night. There was no warning. One moment, the apartment was silent, the city lights glittering below. The next, the reinforced glass of the windows imploded inward, and the world dissolved into chaos and the deafening roar of gunfire. Zara screamed, diving behind the sofa. Jean Quan was already moving. He moved through the violence like it was a language he was born speaking. He pulled a gun from a hidden compartment under a coffee table, his movements economical and lethal. He didn't shout. He didn't panic. He became an instrument of quiet, surgical death. He fired twice, and 2 of the black-clad figures who had crashed through the windows crumpled to the floor. He grabbed Zara's arm, pulling her up. "Stay behind me," he ordered, his voice calm amidst the mayhem. He shoved her toward the central corridor that led to the bedrooms. More men were coming, pouring in from the private elevator. A bullet ricocheted off the marble wall next to her head, and she cried out. Jean Quan whirled, pushing her so hard she stumbled and fell into the hallway as he shielded her body with his own. He grunted, a sharp, guttural sound, and for a horrifying second, his legs buckled. He'd been hit. Another attacker lunged from a side room, aiming for Jean Quan's exposed back. There was no time to think. Zara scrambled to her feet, her eyes landing on a heavy, abstract metal sculpture on a pedestal by the wall. She grabbed it, the weight of it shocking, and swung it with all her strength. It connected with the side of the man's head with a sickening crunch. He dropped like a stone. Zara stared down at him, at the blood matting his hair, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The sculpture slipped from her numb fingers and clattered to the floor. She had just crossed a line she could never uncross. The room was suddenly silent. The remaining attackers were gone, having fled or been neutralized by Jean Quan's men who were now swarming the apartment. Jean Quan was leaning against the wall, clutching his side where blood was soaking through his shirt. He was looking at her, at the man she had taken down. There was no judgment in his eyes. There was something far more terrifying. Understanding. He saw her now. He truly saw her. Later, after his men had cleared the bodies and the broken glass, she found herself patching him up again. The bullet had grazed his ribs, a deep, bleeding furrow. Her hands were shaking this time, the adrenaline giving way to a bone-deep tremor of shock. "You shouldn't have had to do that," he said, his voice low. He was watching her hands, the way they trembled as she taped a bandage in place. "You shouldn't have been bleeding in my alley," she countered, her voice sharp with unshed tears. He reached up, his fingers gently touching her cheek, his thumb wiping away a smudge of dust. His touch was electric, a stark contrast to the violence that had just consumed them. "I am not a good man, Zara," his voice was raw, stripped of all its usual command. "But for the last 3 days, I have watched you red in the morning sun, and I have forgotten what I am. It was not a declaration of love. It was a confession, something far more dangerous and honest. It was an admission that she was a light in his endless darkness, a light he had no right to, a light he would inevitably extinguish. The next day, one of his men brought her a small, elegant box. Inside was a burner phone. The first message was already there. It was a photo, a picture of the front door of her old apartment building. In the photo, a single, dead red rose was taped to the door. Her door. The message beneath it was simple. We know where to find your ghost. They weren't just targeting him anymore. The enemy, the Choi clan his men had named as the traitors, had made it personal. They were targeting her. Her old life wasn't just gone. It was being used as a weapon against her. Jin Kwon was planning his response, a final, decisive strike against the Choi family. He had his lieutenants in the living room, blueprints of a warehouse district spread across the glass table. He intended to leave her here, in the penthouse, surrounded by guards. Safe. A protected liability. She walked into the room, the burner phone clutched in her hand. The men fell silent. I'm coming with you, she said. Jin Kwon's face was stone. No. They're doing this because of me, she insisted, her voice gaining strength. They think I'm your weakness. Let me be your weapon instead. This is not a game, Zara. That man I hit, she said, her voice dropping, forcing him to listen. Before I hit him, he was speaking into his wrist. I heard him say a name. The heron and a time. Midnight. Jin Kwon's eyes narrowed. He exchanged a look with his senior lieutenant. The heron was a code name for a smuggler who used the docks. The warehouse plans on the table were for a different location, an inland depot. It was a trap. She had just saved all their lives. He looked back at her, a long, silent appraisal. He saw not the girl from the alley, but the woman who had survived his world, who had crossed a line for him, and who was now refusing to be sidelined. Stay in the car, was all he said. It was not a refusal. It was a concession. The docks were a labyrinth of stacked shipping containers and looming cranes, skeletal against the night sky. Zara sat in the armored sedan, parked in the shadows, her heart a frantic drum. She watched on a small monitor linked to a drone feed as Jin Kwon and his men moved through the maze of steel. It was supposed to be a surgical strike, an ambush turned back on the ambushers. But it went wrong. The head of the Choi clan, a man named Choi Min-jun, was more cunning than they'd anticipated. He had more men. The drone feed dissolved into a chaotic blur of muzzle flashes and shouting. Then she saw it. Jin Kwon, separated from his men, cornered behind a stack of barrels. Min-jun was advancing on him, his own men providing cover fire. Panic seized her. She was supposed to stay in the car. She was supposed to be safe. But watching him die on a tiny screen was not safety. It was a different kind of death. Her eyes darted around the docks on the screen, searching for something, anything. And then she saw it. A massive crane, its hook dangling a container of what looked like steel pipes directly over the area where Min-jun's men were concentrated. She looked at the driver, one of Jin Kwon's most trusted men. Can you get me to that crane control booth? He looked at her, then at the screen. He understood. It's a suicide run. He's going to die anyway, she said, her voice cold and certain. The man didn't hesitate. He put the car in gear. The sedan tore through the dockyard, drawing a hail of gunfire. Zara kept her head down, her mind focused. The driver skidded to a halt at the base of the crane, and she was out before the car had fully stopped, sprinting for the ladder. Bullets sparked off the metal rungs beside her as she climbed, her lungs burning. She threw herself into the control booth, her hands finding the levers. She had no idea what she was doing, only a vague memory from a high school physics class. Levers, buttons, a release switch. She slammed her hand down on the largest, reddest button she could see. The container of pipes dropped. The sound was apocalyptic, a screech of metal and a thunderous crash as tons of steel met concrete. It landed exactly where Min-jun's men had been clustered, a wave of destruction and chaos. In that moment of stunned silence, Jin Kwon moved. He took down Min-jun in a swift, brutal series of movements. The fight was over. When he found her, She was still in the crane booth, shaking uncontrollably. He didn't say anything. He just pulled her into his arms, his hand tangling in her hair, holding her head against his chest. His heart was hammering as hard as hers. Back in the pristine silence of the penthouse, the city lights seemed brighter, sharper. The threat was gone. Choi Min-jun was dead, his organization shattered. Jean Kwan's empire was secure. A cost had been paid. His best man, the driver who had taken her to the crane, had not made it back. And her own innocence, her old life, was a ghost that would never haunt her again. He stood behind her as she looked out the panoramic window. She could feel the heat of his body, a solid, living presence in the vast, empty room. "They came for you because you are mine," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, a claim laid bare. "And I will burn this city to the ground for what is mine." She didn't flinch from the possessive, brutal honesty of his words. She understood them. In his world, that was the only love that existed, a fierce, violent, and unwavering claim. He was a king, and she, somehow, had become his territory. She turned from the window to face him. His face was bruised, his eyes weary, but they held hers with an intensity that left no room for doubt. He would protect what was his, and he had decided she belonged to him. She thought of the girl who took out the trash, the girl who dreamed of nothing more than making next month's rent. That girl was gone. In her place was a woman who had tasted violence and had not broken. A woman who had saved a monster, and in doing so, had found a part of herself she never knew existed. She looked at this dangerous, broken, beautiful man, the architect of her new reality. She did not run. She reached out and deliberately, carefully, placed her hand on his chest, right over his heart. It was a choice, an answer, a truth.